Alan Charles was a cocaine addict for 24 years. While he had good reason to seek solace in drugs, he also had good reason not to. At least that's how I felt reading his compelling memoir, Walking Out the Other Side, An Addict's Journey from Loneliness to Life. When still a young boy, Alan lost his father suddenly. His mother seemed unable to cope, to emotionally shut down. And Alan's younger brother descended into mental illness, terrorizing and abusing Alan and his mother. But Alan seemed to cope, finishing school, doing reasonably well, befriended by neighbors who helped, encouraged, and employed him. Alan went on to have multiple careers in baseball, harness racing, media. It really seems he could do anything he set his mind to, and do it well. And he had the tenacity to try anything, sell himself as proficient, even though he was not, and to succeed nonetheless. But cocaine owned him, and he managed to pursue those multiple careers while under its influence, until he was on the verge of destruction and likely death. Clearly, Alan did survive, and he remains drug-free since 2008. Now he helps others who seem hopelessly addicted. What is remarkable about his memoir is the detail and emotion he achieves, and I wonder, while so addled and consumed with cocaine, how did he recall with such precision the events and people woven into his tragic tale? Alan Charles is here today. I'm Alice Bloom. This is A Town and Village 2. Welcome back. Alan, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me, Alice.
Well, I have to tell you that your book really was compelling. I started to read it and thought, oh, this is going to be just a story. But one of the things, as I mentioned in my opening, that was so amazing to me was the amount of detail that you could recall. I mean, I don't know a lot about drug addiction. I know a lot more now after reading your book. And I always expected that somebody who was so consumed with scoring and the next drug fix was not really absorbing everything that was happening around them. How did you recall so much?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. So for me, my drug addiction didn't start till I was 24 years old. So my memory from the time I was 2 years old was just incredible. I just would remember every single thing that came by my way. I got to a point where I was in high school and then in college where I would go in and I would make sure that I would attend class and I would listen and I would write the notes down. But I stopped buying books because by listening and writing down, it would ingrain in my head and I would memorize everything. So I don't know if I have one of those type of memories they talk about, but I was able to remember everything. And then as life started to go on, I had a friend of mine, my friend Ralph, who was a catcher on the baseball team in college, and we stayed close after we graduated. And so when I was 24, 25, 26, we would talk every couple of months to catch up and see how life was going. And I would tell him stories of what I was going through or what happened to me. And he goes, oh my God, there's another story for your book. And so that was the seed that planted in my head because I had all these Forrest Gump type moments, incredible things that were happening. And for the most part, even though I had a tragic early path and my dad passed away and all the things that we may talk about, in my mind, I felt like I had a happy life. Until I got therapy, I thought my beginning part of my life that I had this great life. And so I just remembered everything and it worked to my benefit.
Have you ever been checked to see if you had one of those amazingly potent memories that allow you to recall dates and names and exactly what somebody wore and ate on a particular day?
No, I can't do that. I know Mary Lou Henner has that, and whatever, there's a term for it. I'm not like that, but my memory is pretty good.
Close. It was pretty amazing. Before we get started on your personal story, I'm really eager to hear, and I think our audience would as well, how you got started on cocaine, because you did not show an inclination towards drugs early on. You didn't use as a teenager, the times when a lot of people do get started. But before we do that, you were addicted to cocaine. What we hear a lot about now are opioid addiction and heroin addiction. Is there really a difference in personality or pattern of drug addiction Does it matter what you're addicted to?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. The bottom line is whether it's alcohol, whether it's cocaine, whether it's opioids, it's a drug addiction and it's a disease. And what ends up happening is as you continue to do it, my understanding, because I've been through 4 inpatient rehabs and 15 outpatient, so I'm not a doctor, but I happen to have a lot of information about it, and it changes the chemistry of your brain. So that's what ends up starting to happen. And in my case, which is not the usual case, I believe I was addicted from that very first line that I did. So when I go out and I share with kids and, you know, preteens and teens, and I've been speaking to people in colleges and high schools on the dangers of drug addiction, that I want them to know that they're playing Russian roulette, because you never know if you do that first line or you take that first hit, if that's going to be it. And then you lose the ability to make decisions and to choose, because once I was addicted to cocaine, my option to make choices totally went away, and I was a slave to that drug.
I think that's probably a very apt description, being a slave to the drug. Is there any way to predict what person or which person would be addicted to drugs and who might get a buy?
You know, you can make a stereotypical projection of the type, maybe an addictive personality, or you can say somebody that comes from poverty, that maybe they struggle and they're looking to escape. But from my experience and what I've seen, it's a non-offender to everybody. It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what your race is or your nationality. You could be in Washington Heights or in bad areas in the Bronx, or you can be living in Scarsdale and East Hampton. You have an equal opportunity to get this disease and to be affected by addiction.
So no one is immune to this.
No one is immune to this.
Okay, let's backtrack for a while. We know that your father died suddenly, and as you say, you thought you had a happy childhood. In reading the book, we realized that your mom wasn't really able to be there for you, that she probably could have used some assistance herself. She had shut down pretty well, and that she was just trying to hold your brother at bay, trying to keep him from lashing out, or he did some pretty horrible, violent things. You didn't start using then. You didn't start using during your, what looked like a very difficult childhood. When did you start?
The first time that I did drugs or did cocaine was I was 24 years old. And growing up, I was so anti-drug. My first, and I think I referred to it in the book, that baseball was my first drug because it was my escape for all the craziness that was going on in my house. And as you referred to, you know, my mom checked out emotionally. So I was left to fend. I was the head of the household from the time I was 9. My brother was 7, and that's when my dad died. My mother, you know, which I didn't find out till later on when my mom passed when she was 36, I found out that my dad committed suicide, but I was told that he died of a heart attack. And so my mother just could not deal with it. And my mom was a big fashion model in the 50s in Manhattan, and she graduated from high school, but she didn't have a profession. She was a stay-at-home mom. A lot of women didn't work back in those days if they were married. And so she really didn't have the wherewithal to make money. So when my dad died, his business wasn't doing well, and we were left with nothing. We were on and off welfare, and literally I took over the house at 9. We had bill collectors coming. They were calling the house. My father had this business and he owed everybody money. Probably not even a week after my father passed, we had this guy come to the door looking to repossess my father's car. He had owed 3 payments or something like that. So he came to the door. I was answering the door. I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, you know, he wanted to talk to my father. I said, "My father's not alive. You can talk to me." And he asked for my mother.
And
I said,
you were about 9 or 10?
I was 9 years old, and I handled the whole thing. I said to him, "If we give you the keys back and I'll give you the car back, will that make everything go away?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "You'll have to come back tomorrow. I have to discuss this with my mother." And
so you were making decisions at 9 years old.
yeah, I look back at it, and my daughters are now 13 and 11, and I look back as they passed 9 years old, and I'm like, how the hell did I do
But
that?
but I'm just trying to understand. So during this time, you didn't feel encumbered. You didn't feel the weight of the decisions
Oh,
that you were
no.
asked to make. I mean, you just did what you
I
had
took
to
over
do.
because I thought that's what you do. I
So
didn't know
what
any
happened
different.
at 24 that made you
Well,
start to use drugs?
as I started, I played baseball and I went to college and I had a professional baseball career for a year. I played down in the Dominican Republic. I was a pitcher. I had problems with my arm, so that was pretty much the writing on the wall. My career looked like it was ending. I had an opportunity to play in Mexico and decided it's time to work. I had my college degree. You don't make a lot of money playing minor league baseball. So I started working. I met a girl, and it was my first love relationship, and I threw everything into it. I never had anybody that I can talk with and talk about my feelings, and I started opening up to her. After about a year and a half, things started going backwards, and it wasn't right. So at that point, I started grieving the loss of her, the first love relationship, and then I had never grieved the loss of baseball, which has been a part of my life. So I was in a very bad place in my life, and I had this friend that I knew for a handful of years, and he would periodically ask me if I wanted to do coke or do drugs, and every time I'd say, I don't do things like that. Playing baseball, I always took care of my body, and I worked out, and that was so important to me of what I put in my body that that was the last thing. I was the last person that would ever do drugs. And at this weak moment, he said, do you want to try this? So he laid a line out, and I did what I saw on television in the movies, and I took the straw and went and snorted it. And that feeling that came over me when I did it, it was like, oh my God, I had had this knot in my stomach every day from the time my father died when I was 9. And that knot instantaneously disappeared. And I believe I was addicted from that very first line.
Wow, what a story. So that's a cautionary tale to people. Deal with your issues, get help, get therapy, but don't turn to drugs.
Absolutely.
So from your tale in the book, at first you were able to manage this as kind of a recreational opportunity. I mean, you could use drugs, but you were working and you went to college and you did play ball, I guess, in Florida, in Tampa, I think
I went
it
to
was.
Miami, and then I transferred to
Tampa.
Tampa, and that's where I graduated from.
Okay, so you were able to manage the drugs and worked, and you worked in media, you worked in harness racing, you owned horses. I mean, you did some fantastic things. I mean, really lots of adventures. And you always had that kind of, I guess the word is perspicacity. You were able to say, sure, I can do it, even though you hadn't a clue how to race a horse or whatever. And you did it.
I've always, and I think that goes back to, you know, my upbringing and what ended up happening being 9 years old and having to jump in and do things. I didn't know the meaning of you can't do something. I just believed at that point. One of the things that I think was that I want to share with you that was important that I did speak about in the book is I kind of had this mantra starting at 9 years old. I would walk to school after my dad passed, and I really didn't understand religion or spirituality, and I was trying to connect where my father went after he passed. So I would talk to myself, or I would talk out loud walking to school, and I'm like, okay, am I praying to God, or is my father with God and he's a conduit? And I would laugh because I would say, well, okay, now I have a connection upstairs and I want to play Major League Baseball, so now this is going to help me. But I ended up with this mantra that I would walk to school saying to myself that I'm alone on this planet, I'm all by myself, and no matter what, I can get out of any situation or do anything that I want to do, and nobody can stop me.
Do you think loneliness is a big theme throughout your book? I mean, it's part of your title as well. But there are so many times where you felt alone. You weren't really, but you perceived yourself as being alone. Do you see it that way? Do you see that it's a state of mind, sometimes more so than the reality? I mean, everybody is basically alone. I mean, we all have to go through things ourselves. But you had people who reached out to you, and you had people who helped you, a neighbor who took you in. It was kind of like a big brother or a young dad to you, and then he gave you a job. And there were other people along the way, mostly men. You had an aunt who also extended herself to you. I mean, there were there's plenty of evidence that you really weren't alone. You had suffered a terrible tragedy, and I'm not invalidating that or minimizing that. But there were people reaching out, and sometimes your reaction to that was not so grateful.
You know what? This is the first time that I'm looking at it that way based on you telling me that, because I felt that, and I still do, that I was all alone. Now, you mentioning this, I'm looking at it and thinking about it like, wow, you know what? You're right. There were people out there. But I had gotten into a place that like I just shared with you, at 9 years old, implemented in my head that I am on this planet alone, and I ran with that. That's how I felt.
I saw that as a survival mechanism.
And it was, and it was up
and it
until
worked.
until it didn't work anymore. That's what they
Right.
say about drugs. They work until they stop working.
There was one incident, and I think it was the coach at Tampa,
Right.
who benched you. I guess you had had some surgery on your arm.
Oh, yeah, he didn't bench me. What happened was I was coming back from surgery, and he was doing the right thing. He was protecting me.
Right.
But I had pitched 5 innings, and I had a perfect game, which means there was no hits, there was no walks, there
pretty
was no
impressive.
errors. And that's not something that I had ever done. And I felt I was going to throw this perfect game. And he said, we're not going to allow you to go out. We don't want you to hurt yourself. We're going to pull you. And I was pissed. But he was doing it for my own good.
Well, you see that now, but yet you pulled a maneuver on him that made him lose his job.
That wasn't me. I didn't pull a maneuver. There was a whole incident that
He was
happened.
partying with the group, and I guess
There
people
were
took
some things that-
compromising pictures or whatever, and he basically had to resign or was eased out.
There were situations, but I didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay. It seemed like you were sort of gleeful at that, like it was justification, because you were so angry at him for having taken you out of the game.
You know what? I was angry at a lot of people back then, because I went around and I had a chip on my shoulder and I felt like I was all alone, and I think that served me well. And I had you know what, to be completely honest, I had a problem talking to anybody. I walked around behind a mask. What I learned from my mother was that you want to not show people your true feelings and your true colors, because if they really knew you, they wouldn't like you.
Oh, my.
So I walked around not allowing people to know who I was. So whether it was my friends, everything was a superficial relationship. I had no relationship with family. I didn't know how to talk to them. And then it included my coach and other people. So with my coach, I was like, don't come near me.
Right. That's how I saw you. I saw this theme running through the book that you rebuffed people who legitimately tried to help you. I mean, sometimes being paternal is not giving a person everything they want. It's sometimes being a disciplinarian, and sometimes saying no. As a young child, you don't appreciate that. Now that you're a dad, you probably see it a little differently.
Absolutely.
You know, you can't have everything you want when you want it. But another theme that runs through, and you've touched on this, is the feeling of always being a fake or a fraud. And I've heard that from other very accomplished people, that they always thought they were phoning it in, that they were going to get found out one day.
You know what? There's a saying that I learned as I got sober and better, and they say, fake it until you make it. And somehow I had that from very early on, that I might be thinking or feeling something, but somehow I put my mask on and I faked it, and I just did what I thought I needed to do, and I got through everything.
And did the drugs help perpetuate that ability to fake it?
You know what, I got what would be the best wording for that? With the drugs, I became very manipulative, and I became chameleon-like, because I had to be very careful of what I was doing to allow people to see me or not see me in a certain light. So for instance, I didn't start till late in life. I was 24, so the baseball part was over. But when I started racing horses, I was up for random drug testing, and I was driving, and it's dangerous, it makes sense. I was driving a 1,200-pound animal where you can't see above the horse, where you're on the racetrack in these very light race bikes, or sulkies as they call them. You're banging into each other. The horses don't steer like cars, and so they give you a breathalyzer before you drive, and then they randomly drug test people. So I knew that I could not act or be around anybody to give that persona because I didn't want to get drug tested.
How did you evade the drug testing?
Well,
It was random.
It was random, and fortunately, I never was in a situation. I was tested a handful of times, and it just happened to be on days when I wasn't using. I never used cocaine while I was driving racehorses, and I would use it after I was done. So I tried to do the best I could, and I wouldn't use with anybody at the racetrack. So I was always on the lookout to be careful not to show. Now, towards the end, as things started to get worse, and it's a progressive disease, my life was starting to fall apart. So then there were times where I couldn't even show up to drive because I was messed up.
Now, you went to rehab, you said, 4 times?
I was 4 inpatient and 16 outpatient.
How come you went that last time?
The last time I went was about a year before I finally got sober. My therapist, who was a godsend, her name was Nancy, I had been seeing her since 2000. And so this was 2006, the last inpatient rehab that I went to. She said to me that I needed to show myself and come out from behind the mask. She said, I am the only one in this world that knows you. You are not allowing people to know you, and you're never going to get better unless you put yourself out there. And so I promised, and she said I needed a really high-end rehab. So I went to a place called the Meadows, which is in Wickensburg, Arizona, and it's one of the top rehabs in the country. And they had this one part of their 30-day program is something called Survivors, and it's a week where they do extreme work and take you back to your childhood. And I was hypnotized, and what was found out was that I was yelling and screaming. I had woken up with my brother holding a knife to my neck and bleeding. And they told me that it happened a handful of times, and that's what I was sharing while I was under. And from that, they diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I had no recollection of that happening in the household.
Wow. Yet you've been to 3 other rehabs. That makes me think that rehabs are not all created equal.
They're not, but one of the key factors in somebody getting better is a desire to want to get better. So the disease, the drugs have such a hold on you. A lot of people that are going through addiction are in denial, and I was no different. For a long time, I didn't think I had a problem, or maybe I thought I did, but it's like, you know what, I'm different than anybody else. I can use, and I feel good, and I like to party, and I deserve to, and wherever your head goes from there. But it took a long time until I was ready and able to make that commitment. And having 2 daughters was a very key factor in me finally being ready.
But how old were the girls when you went to this last rehab?
God, it's 2006, so they were 2 and 4.
Okay. It just seems that having children is a pretty sobering experience for anybody. I mean, it's a life-changing experience. Suddenly you're responsible for the life of another human being.
Right.
And yet that didn't pull you to reality.
No, there was a time while we were separated in 2006, and as we were going through a divorce and we were in court sometime in 2007, my ex, or she was my wife at the time, she told me, because she was afraid because I was using so much and she wouldn't let me around the kids that much, especially when she thought I was using. So she petitioned the court, and her attorney had me tested one day when I came in to do the divorce proceedings, and I couldn't stop. So I knew I was getting tested, and I took precautionary stuff. They have this stuff that they say helps you beat a test. So I was taking these pills and liquids and trying to flush my system, trying to beat the test. And I went in and got tested. And then when I first walked into court, then we went in front of the judge. The judge said, you were you tested positive for cocaine, and you will no longer be able to talk or see your children for 6 months until you could produce weekly clean tests that you've been clean for 6 months. And at that point, I broke down because I knew how sick I was, and what that meant was I wasn't going to be able to see my kids because I knew I couldn't stop.
So that finally
That jarred me, but there was still another 6 months before I finally got clean after
Because,
that.
I mean, your pattern of behavior was to reject people who tried to hold you accountable. It was always somebody else's fault, or somebody else was responsible for your problems.
Yeah, sure.
Now, were you able to come clean without using medications?
You know, it was interesting because for 5 years, the last 5 years of my use, I had been seeing this therapist, and I also went to a psychiatrist, and I had anxiety. I was going through depression, was all a part of this. So I had tried Prozac and Lexapro and probably 5 or 6 other drugs, but nothing worked because I was doing cocaine with them. And then when I was doing cocaine, I would be scared that there would be counteraction, so I would stop doing the medication. So I never gave anything a chance to work. So for me, what ended up happening is once I got sober, and my date of sobriety is December 8th, 2007, so almost 2008, I decided that I don't want any medication. I want to be clean. I want my system clean. Let's see what happens. And at this point, 8.5 years later, I haven't found it necessary to have to be on medication.
That's wonderful.
Not that it wouldn't help me, but with anxiety. But I am not on anything for
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Do you ever think that you could use again?
You know what? I have a healthy fear. I think anybody that would say that they will never use again is grossly fooling themselves and putting themselves in harm's way. What has been explained to me and what I understand is this is a disease. So I have this disease for the rest of my life. I just choose to practice a program of recovery. So I attend, you know, I maybe go to a meeting a week or a couple, depending on the week, but I go to AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, and CA, which is Cocaine Anonymous. And I practice a program of recovery. So I have somebody that's a sponsor that I talk to every day, and I talk to other people every day.
Okay.
And I talk to other people that are in a program, and I do fellowship. I go out to dinner with these people after I go to a meeting. So by staying connected, they know my personality. So if they see me off kilter, they point that out to me of what's going on. So by practicing this program, I know that I'm not that far away from going back and doing it.
Well, I hope you stay connected, and I wish you all of the best. I hope that your story helps other people out there who are struggling with it, struggling with drug addiction, whatever drug it is, and maybe helps those who are not get started along that road again. I wish you luck. I know you're doing so much outreach with young people, and I think that's just wonderful, and I really commend you for it. Alan, thank you so much for telling us your story.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Alice.
You're welcome. I'm Alice Bloom. We'll see you next time.